America, my name is Osei-Frimpong, and here today with me is ZaId Jilani. Jilani is a leftist, center-ish thinker, even if he's never actually identified as part of that kind of movement, but he's been a journalist in that space for a variety of different organizations. So he probably knows more about that space than many avowed radical leftist. So he's been a journalist working in center and left of center thought for the last, I don't know, probably 15 years, 15, 20
I
years,
think
Zed?
that's I think that's fair to say 15 is probably about right.
15 years. And I think, is that a fair rehearsal of like your milieu, the water in which you've been swimming in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you summarize it pretty well. I mean, in terms of the places I've worked, I think either some of them were avowedly progressive, whereas some of them were like avowedly mainstream and kind of more moderate or centrist in that regard, right? And I've also done a little bit of writing for conservative publications, although I haven't been like on staff with a conservative publication, right? More like on a freelance basis, that kind of thing.
And you did all of that without ever getting, as it were, lost in the sauce. Um, and I think that in a way that I think is respectable and audible, and I think it important because you never actually thought that the left really knew what it was doing in an important way, so that it couldn't be criticized from a more kind of reasonable or responsible perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is sometimes, there's an issue on both sides of the political spectrum of echo chambers, right? Where like people, I think, adopt kind of a tribal attitude where they feel defensive towards any criticism or defensive towards any kind of disagreement. And then I think they respond often by thinking that it's adversarial or that you're on the other team or so on and so forth. But the reality is that like, everybody kind of needs a process of critique and self-critique, right, to improve themselves. Like that's just like how the whole thing works. And I think once you stop doing that is when you develop blind spots, right? And when you stop like seeing what is holding you back, really, right? Like every successful social political movement, I think, can do that self-criticism. So
Yeah, good. And you've been part of that self-criticism process internal to the movement. Now, I want to start with the question of why isn't the entire United States going to be Florida? Why isn't the whole U.S. Georgia? Insofar as it's not clear to me that this last electoral sweep of the Republican Party is going to stop, or that the Democrats are going to self-correct and bring in more Americans, either convince more Americans that the Democrats are right in the way that the Republicans are wrong, or change policies to become more of where Americans are. It's not clear to me that the Democratic Party can self-correct. So maybe JD Vance wins with a 350 vote, electoral vote landslide over Gavin Newsom. And if that happens, not only will I not be surprised, I might even be supportive of it. Go ahead. So why isn't
yeah,
the
I
U.S.
mean,
going to turn into Georgia?
no, I mean, it's a really good question. I think that one, if we're just talking about the next presidential election, there's always going to be factors outside of our control, right? I mean, who knows? There might be another pandemic. There could be a big recession, some kind of like, shock to the economy, large wars or something that could change the trajectory of things, right? But I think what you're talking about is more like the larger, broader social and political trends that go beyond, every
A shock.
election or every 4 years, right? And I think in terms of that, there's been, I think, a real weakness in like the Democratic Party coalition post Obama, right? And it actually, some of those weaknesses were exposed even when Obama was president. But I think that we had we had acknowledged and recognized that Obama was carrying states like Missouri. Obama won Florida twice, right? Obama was able to win North Carolina, right? Many of these states now seem out of reach for Democrats, even when they were in reach for Democrats, even within 6 to 8 years ago, right? Like even Florida, which is considered to be a very red state now, to where Biden and then Kamala Harris really did not contest it. Even that state only barely went to Ron DeSantis in 2018, right? Like he only barely won the vote versus Andrew Gillum. And now, like we look at Florida and we think that it is basically one of the most solid red states. It's not even worth contesting or competing anymore for Democrats, right?
Yeah,
There
for
aren't that
reasons.
many, right?
for reasons. It's not as if the Republicans in Florida, the Democrats in Florida gave up, or the Republicans in Florida just got lucky. There are reasons. There are now principled Republicans in Florida who were principled Democrats 15 years ago. And
You're right.
that speaks to a quality of democratic incompetence. I think that was exposed during the pandemic, but it's kind of always been there. And we're going to segue a little bit about how I think it's tied to the inability of Democrats to understand the work of family in politics. But
Look, I think
Yeah.
also that like, so like we see like a lot of people are talking about California right now, right? Because the wildfires and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. But also like that's tied into a larger like narrative, which is like if you look at the states that were losing population the past 2, 4, 6 years, however you want to scale it back, really they're largely blue states. In fact, they were states that were dominated by the Democratic Party, right? So like New York, California, Illinois, I think maybe New Jersey to some extent, were losing population. And they're losing population largely to the Sun Belt, right? They're losing it to Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, probably North Carolina to some extent, right? Like that, there's a lot of people voting with their feet. And, you know, I think to some extent, those people coming into these states make them slightly more liberal. Like, I do think that, like, people moving into Georgia have made it a slightly more competitive state, made it a little bit tougher for the Republicans. But on the other hand, a lot of these people some of these people, I think, learned to like some of the state governance, right? Like, they vote. Like maybe they voted for Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, but also they were voting for Brian Kemp, right? Who's a fairly conservative Republican governor, right? And I think that maybe it's not 100% fair because like, yeah, there's like a lot of media based in New York. So like every New York problem gets blown up into a national problem, right? Like we all know about the ins and outs of it in a way that we might not know about all the problems in some other cities or other locations in the country. But I think there are real failings that Democrats are having in a lot of these zones in the United States. And this has really degraded their governance brand, right? Like even New York City saw a huge swing to the right in this presidential election with Trump getting like, I think he got more votes for a Republican presidential candidate than any in like several decades, if I remember correctly. Kamala Harris had the worst black performance of any Democrat in almost 50 years in the United States. Like, I think a lot of this is just a response to poor governance from the Democrats, right? And both like policies they're implementing, but also I think they're just out of step on culture to some extent, right? Like they don't entirely get the culture of kind of the modern minority family, modern minority, approach to social and religious issues. And I think a lot of this is actually weakening their coalition to where, yeah, it does seem like the party is structurally weak in many ways, right? Like like I said earlier, there are still shocks, external events that could create a good election for the Democrats in 2 years if there's a big recession, or in 4 years, a presidential election. But as a political entity, right, they don't have something like they had after World War II with the New Deal coalition, right? They don't have an enduring coalition that's strong, can withstand a lot of political pressure, and that can stay together in the face of challenges. Because I think their governance brand is just not very, it's not very appealing at the moment.
But I think it shocks a lot of Democrats that you can move to a red state and be happy. And
Yeah.
I really don't think that they can understand the idea that obviously Nevada will never go solid red. When, like I said, I think I'm farther over, and I'm in Georgia, and you know what? I like it here. The weather's nice. Things work for the most part.
Look, I
Culture-
lived in Northern Virginia, worked in
Right.
DC for about 10 years. That was my longest time stretch living outside of Georgia. I was born and raised in Georgia. And, it was nice. There are nice parts about it, but I don't really regret leaving that area. And part of it is that, it's much more affordable to live in Georgia. The people I think are nicer and more chill. Like they're actually more welcoming, I think, than people in Northern Virginia who are largely like DC transplants, people moving in for government jobs and contractor jobs. And, it's just almost everyone I speak to who's made a similar move, including people who were born and raised outside of Georgia, who moved to Georgia, tell me they like the affordability, they like the culture, they like the weather. They don't love everything. Like, I don't think they love our traffic sometimes, or our congestion when you're on the highway. Yeah, there's things we could improve. But at the end of the day, like, governance is just about like, can you raise your family and can you enjoy your life, right? And like, do you feel welcome, right? Like, it's not necessarily about, is your state government pursuing every new fashionable idea that is put out there, which so sometimes it feels like states like California and New York are more into that than in taking care of the basics, right? And if you just can't afford to live in a place, it's not very good no matter what. Like California is a beautiful state, right? But I know so many people who moved out of California, who moved out of places like that, just because you can't afford a home
Yeah.
anymore, right? Like you can't have an extra kid because you don't have room in your home, right? For you have to literally leave your state to find a place where you can afford, right? And like that's the basics, right? And if you're not achieving the basics, what appeal do you have, right? You have dwindling appeal. So
Right. This idea that I have an easier time raising my family in Georgia um, than I would in California. And I grew up in California. I grew up in LA and I spent a big time in Northern California. If I lived there right now, I'd be stressed out because everything costs and everything costs and everything costs. And now I'm in Georgia. I got a house for a song 10 years ago and it's big enough for my dreams. And I'm not worried about having to earn and earn and earn. By the way, people
right.
at home, if you appreciate what I'm doing, I think you should, giving you a quality of wisdom that maybe you don't get in every YouTube space or podcast. Go to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month. And, I'll kind of keep doing what I'm doing, which I think is good for the national discourse. But yes, if I was doing this gig in Northern California, maybe I would have greater density and I would bump into more people, so I would earn more money that way doing what I'm doing. But I think everything would cost in a way that my entire life would be stressful that I don't feel here in red Georgia, even if I don't agree with state governance. And I cannot be the only Democrat in Georgia or Florida who is very happy that I pandemicked here as opposed to there. Because if I would have pandemic there, I would not have been very happy at all. I would have been upset with all these people trying to mask my, 4-year-old at the time and like expecting them to do Zoom school and all that. I think it's all ridiculous.
I always remember an Atlantic magazine headline. What? And what Brian Kemp had done is he had lifted some restrictions so people get haircuts. Like you'd still wear a mask, when you go into the barbershop or whatever, but you could at least do it. Right. And there was a headline in the Atlantic magazine that said Georgia's experiment in human sacrifice. And I thought, wait, they think that going to get a haircut is human sacrifice? Like this was the mentality coming out of like New York and DC at the time, right? And
yeah, I don't want that mentality governing my life.
And I remember I went to one of Brian Kemp's re-election rallies in 2022, and I spoke to a gentleman who was there, and he was telling me how the number one thing that he really loved Kemp about was that he owns some businesses, he's a small businessman, and Kemp, let him reopen and operate safely, and he was, it would have ruined him had he not done that, right? And like this makes a difference to people, right? Like people, that's the basics in your life is doing things like this, and like. It was a very for him, it was just common sense to vote for Kemp after that, right? I mean, I'm sure he has his other reasons as well, but like it does make a difference to people.
Right. And it's not an experiment in who it can be considered or interpreted as an experiment in human life, but it could also be interpreted as an experiment in human freedom. Right. Insofar as, being able to purchase services and consume services and produce services in civil society is one of the ways in which people express their freedom and their way of life and make and fashion and create their way of life. It was easier to do that in a Georgia and a Florida than it was in a California. So I don't know. I think there was a real life test of how committed Democrats are to thinking through what freedom requires. And not every different stage, but in a lot of different stages, they kind of take the wrong turn. And like you could talk about internal works within the party, like with respect to kind of Nancy Pelosi pushing out Joe Biden and anointing Kamala Harris without even an apology to the people about the abrogation of process, and just a quality of insouciance and just easy moral virtue. My theory is that Democrats have been right, or the left progressives, the self-styled progressives, have been right from the civil rights movement to like gay marriage, and it made them lazy about thinking through issues where they have been wrong. And now they just assume that they're on the right side of history. When
there's definitely that like what you just mentioned, they definitely always have a sense of historical inevitability to what they're doing. And I think part of that is like when you look at like the like so one thing about this election that I think I underestimated was exactly how upset a lot of Americans were about the transgender activist issues. And like I knew the Democrats were yeah, I knew they were somewhat out of step in public opinion. Like you could see that in surveys. But I think what I underestimated though was how like potent the issue was, right? Like how much it put the Democrats in a space where they just felt like they were a weird party or an esoteric political party because of how adamant they were about the issue and maintaining their position, right? Like if you go back like 20 years, right, and you talk to Democrats about abortion, I felt like they used to have like a range of views on abortion. There used to be like some pro-life Democrats, some really religious Democrats who would advocate for those points of view, even in Congress. I think like a quarter of the House Democratic caucus under the first term of Obama was pro-life, like before the 2010 wipeout. When it came to like social issues today, it seems like the Democrats often just have like complete unanimity, right? Like there's almost no Democrats who would like say something like, I don't think like a 5-year-old really is we should be affirming their gender choice, right? Or like I do think it's unfair that to have someone who's biologically a man compete in these sports where everyone else is biologically a woman. I mean, it's not a fair competition, and it's just not it's not fair to the athletes. It's not really that interesting to the audience to have a competition like that. It's a very if I just talk to anyone off the street, like even a Democrat, like a lot of them are going to agree with me when I say those things, right? But it's remarkable how rare it is to find a Democratic elected official, a major like liberal pundit, anyone with like some heft in the Democratic Party say those things. And just because for some reason they've developed a very strict party line on those issues. And I think that lack of diversity on the Democratic opinion on that has made them seem like the ones who are, they're the ones who are kind of strict, out of touch, lacking in diversity, lacking in critical thought, lacking in, honestly, just lacking in respect to some extent, right? Because it's not like everybody who doesn't agree with the Democratic left on these issues is like some retrograde hater, some kind of caveman or something or whatever they think. A lot of them are just like, it's a new thing. They're kind of confused about it. They're not 100% sold, just like anyone who's just exposed to a new idea.
And then you got
And they
pharmaceuticals
have,
involved.
yeah, I mean, it's an issue where the Democratic Party, I think, has become just, they've been unable to. I think they're like unable to debate certain things because they're afraid of getting called phobic or ismed or something like that. When the reality is like people have to be able to debate and discuss things. You can't just install a chip into their brain and make them agree with you, right? Like even if the Democrats are on the right side of history on this issue, and it's debatable, history takes time to work out, right? Like it's a whole process, and they're trying to short circuit the process. So
yeah, and they seem unwilling or unable to have to even take ownership of the need to debate. For example, let's take the internal MAGA civil war going on between in H-1B visas, between the tech right and the nativist right. And I think the effectiveness with which the GOP has now taken over all sides of the issue. Right? People think if it's a civil war and it's going to destroy the party. Actually, it strengthens the party because now, whether you feel very strongly on one side or very strongly on the other, you have a home in the GOP. And I'm not even sure that you have a home in the Democratic Party insofar as if you feel strongly, protectionist. So
I mean, look, one of the most frequent topics of Kamala Harris campaign ads, I mean, this may have been from her super PAC more than her campaign, but from her coalition, was against Trump's tariffs, right? Like very much saying that they're a sales tax and like we don't need to do that, and and like I think the Democratic Party is broadly associated with free movement of people and free movement of capital, right? Like free trade and free immigration, right? Like that's their brand. It doesn't mean every Democrat believes that, but it's more or less their brand. And Trump's brand has been kind of the opposite, right? Even though there are divisions within the Republican Party, as we saw with the H-1B debate, right? There are plenty of people in the Republican Party who want, free trade, and they don't want so much of a crackdown on immigration. But then there's also people in the Republican Party on the opposite side, right? And so, like as you said, just by being the party where people are openly debating that, they're kind of making it a home for someone no matter what side of the debate they're on, right? They can say, well, in this party, they at least talk about these things, right? In this party, it's at least a debate. So I can go and watch that debate. I can participate in the debate. Whereas the Democratic Party largely sat it out. I mean, Bernie did get involved recently, which I think was probably a positive for him and a positive for Democrats, although I haven't really seen other Democrats get involved on either side of the debate in the way that he did.
Yeah, and I think that it means something that you can actually have an internal debate, and your party is open to having an issue. All right, so tell the people where they can find your stuff right now while I figure out what's going on with my kid.
Oh yeah, so I write a newsletter on Substack called The American Saga, so you can just go to theamericansaga.com. I also freelance at a bunch of different publications, but that's just like you could go to Google and find those, or maybe I'll post them on my social media on Twitter or X sometimes. But my newsletter, where I post like original content, is theamericansaga.com. And I also, just like I said, I freelance other places. I go on podcasts like this. And I try to maintain an X presence, although sometimes I take a break and I just don't tweet for like a week or something. And it doesn't mean I died or anything. It just means that sometimes everyone's got to take a break from social media because it wears you down and you forget how to write long form and and collect your thoughts, and you end up fighting with some guy who has 12 followers, and it's no, you can't do that all the time. So yeah, those are kind of the places that I'm active and working at. So
it's good. Good. All right. So now let's talk about, the Republican Party as a party of the big tent, which I actually think, and the party of big tent and competent governance, that's not going to be an easy party to beat. And, in some ways they kind of deserve it because either the Democrats have been so incompetent nationwide, and they're both in branding and in actual governance. And a lot of the easy issues have been kind of resolved. For example, and I don't know if I can say this in Democratic spaces, I actually am okay with Dobbs. Dobbs, yeah, I think I think it's a reasonable. I think it's a reasonable compromise on an issue where I can't tell Catholics not to feel a certain way, and I can't tell abortion on demand people not to feel a certain way. So I feel like this is actually one of the best things we could do. It's in the spectrum of a reasonable compromise, even if I'm pro-choice myself.
Well, I think part of it is also that a lot of people anticipated that when Dobbs came into force, that you would just see abortion banned nationwide, right? And I think what's becoming clear right now is that's very unlikely for a number of reasons. One is that, it would take Congress to overcome a filibuster, president to sign it into law, so on and so forth for that to happen. And that's just not happening. I think the Republicans aren't really eager to do that. A lot of them are actually fine making it a states issue. And in a lot of states, when they bring the issue to the ballot, the pro-choice side wins. Not always. There were actually a couple losses in the recent election, but and if you think about it, that's how most countries handle abortion, right? They bring it to a legislature, they bring it to voters, they let them decide. They don't really have a court case. It just says, okay, this is the law of the land, right? That's probably more rare in the world. So yeah, I mean, the Dobbs decision, I think Americans will probably make their peace with it eventually, right? I don't think it had a big impact on the election. I think the Democrats had really convinced themselves that it would. If you listen to Ezra Klein's podcast, Democratic commentator for New York Times, he's pretty interesting insight into the Democratic world. And he said that people in the party kept telling him that Dobbs and democracy would swing the election towards the Democrats. What does democracy mean? I don't know. It's just a brand for the Democrats now. I'm not even sure what that means. Dobbs was pretty clear. It's pretty clear what they meant with Dobbs, though, right? They thought that unless Roe v. Wade was reinstated by the courts or nationally through Congress, that there would be a big backlash against the Republicans. It would help the Democrats quite a bit, but it never materialized, right? And I think part of that is that while a lot of Americans still think abortion should be legal up to a certain point, they don't necessarily see the Dobbs regime as outlawing abortion as strictly or as harshly all over the country as maybe they anticipated. And also it's not necessarily a priority issue for a lot of people, including women, right? I think a lot of people felt like it would polarize women to the Democratic camp, but didn't really, I remember a quote I read during the midterm election from I think she was in Virginia. There was a woman in Virginia. She said something like, I'm not having an abortion every day, but I got to go get groceries every day, right? That's how she prioritized the issues in her mind, right? Of course, abortion wasn't banned in Virginia anyway. And so It wasn't even a choice for her. But I think that's just the way the issue ended up shaking out, and it really surprised the party. In the same way all these other social issues are surprising the party. I think they don't realize that Americans are not as livid or as energized about those issues as they are.
And they being, I guess, not Americans, or they being just an elite, a specific class of Americans who think that
Look,
they're every American.
I think that if you go to like Democratic Party institutions, and I worked in a bunch of like aligned Democratic Party
You
institutions.
worked in all of them, ZaId.
Yeah, look, I worked at the major think tank that staffed Obama's administration, which is Center for American Progress. I worked for a political action committee for progressives. I worked, campaigns. And I think for most of them, these social cultural issues are very near and dear to their heart and very personal, right? In a way that other issues aren't. Like, I don't think the price of groceries is like nearly as important to your median like Democratic progressive staffer as one of these transgender issues or pro-choice issues or those sorts of things. I think those are the kind of issues that they're kind of inculcated in and enculturated in. And that's it's like their sincere belief, right? They have sincere belief in the righteousness of those causes and topics. It's not like they don't believe in other things, but it's probably those other things probably just aren't as, they're not as salient to them. They're not quite as, potent in their minds in terms of how they're addressing them in their politics, right? And I've noticed that for a number of years. I don't think that's necessarily a new development. It's probably something I've noticed from a decade or more, in terms of how they feel. And, I think even some conservatives pick up on this, right? Like, I think sometimes even conservatives try to do the whole Democrats are the real racist thing because they know that like deploying those kind of cards on them, it actually matters to them, right? Or like calling, people who are critical of Israel anti-Semitic. I think that actually kind of works on Democrats because Democrats get very frazzled by accusations of bigotry, right? Like it's like one of their core beliefs is that you can't be bigoted or even approach anything that could be called bigoted, right? Like I think that's actually one of the reasons that that card kind of works because Democrats kind of do really worry about that like feverishly, right? So, it's a real issue, I think, for these people. And yeah, in terms of, I don't think you can do the same thing about like taxes. I don't think you can do the same thing about like healthcare, like generalized healthcare. I don't think you can do the same thing about housing or something, right? Like you can't like stigmatize a Democrat over those issues nearly as much as you can stigmatize them about these social cultural issues. And that's just because of the nature of who kind of runs the Democratic Party, staffs the Democratic Party, influences them.
All right. So why are Democrats so bad on family? Now, I think Democrats have a lot of like ideas in the abstract that are good for like children, maybe, but they do them at the expense of actually supporting family units. So they try to help children without actually helping families, or insofar as they help families, they're not really serious about families doing the job as families. And at least Republicans actually understand, the GOP understands that like family units matter. And as a parent of 3 kids, I'll tell you right now, the way I'm raising my kids is monstrously different than the way I was raised. And my kids are better at everything that matters than I was because of how I raised them. So the people who don't understand that families like matter as like units and cultural, like I just don't take them serious. So if Democrats were better parents, if I just looked around my Democratic world and I saw, you know what, all these Democrats are really good parents, I would actually have more respect for the party. But that's not the case. The Democrats I know, especially the liberals, are the worst parents in the United States. And I don't think that's great for the brand either. Because at least like the conservative parents, even if I don't agree with all the content, they actually take the job seriously and they understand that families matter. And I don't think in a way that I don't think Democrats do. So like, people who care about families should be knee-jerk Democrats in a well-ordered world, but for reasons, people who care about families are not. And Republicans might do family better. They might be better parents. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think also there's like a parental gap in party identification, right? So I was looking at this thing from Pew, and I'm looking at it right now, and it says that like that about 54% of fathers of kids under 18, so like people in your position, identify with Republicans, right? 44% of men who don't have children identify as Republicans. And part of that's going to be age, right? Younger people lean a little bit more Democratic. But I think even if you adjusted for that, like even if you look at people in the same age bracket, you'll still see that. So like they note that 55% of men ages 35 to 44 who have children under 18 identify with or lean towards the GOP, right? So like even people who are in the age brackets that lean more Democratic, if they have kids, they tend to be leaning more towards the Republicans, right? And so I think that what you're identifying in your personal life or social life is also something that is more broadly true of the political parties right now, which is that the Republicans seem to be a party that really emphasizes settling down, having kids, paying very close attention to what your kids do in school, in their social lives, rearing them kind of very in a very kind of close-knit manner. Whereas I think the Democrats tend to be more associated with the child-free life, right? With like a childless life or a child-free life. It doesn't mean, of course, that there's no Democrats who have kids. That's would be a ridiculous thing to say. But at the same time, I think the Democrats, since probably the time of like women's lib, have tried to make themselves a space or a home for people who don't really value raising kids. And of course, not everybody has to have kids if they don't want to have kids, but like it's just a fact that if you tend to be someone with that orientation, you tend to be more left leaning, right? At least since, the 70s or so on and so forth, when all this kind of evolution happened in the American society. And yeah, I think that does alienate some people who, so I'll give you an example. Like, I think when Florida was passing laws suggesting that, teachers can't discuss gender ideology with their kids, right? Like with like elementary school and so on and so forth. I think a lot of Democrats were like I said, almost completely unified, saying, no, you can't do that. Like we should be able to teach kids about transgender stuff or whatever. But I think when you look at like a lot of the average parents, including Democrats, they were like, what's wrong with that? Like, I don't think that has to be in my school lesson in second grade. Like, even parents who were Democrats, I think didn't really understand why the Democratic Party was so against it. And that's partly, I think, because the Democratic Party viewed
it's not
the
particularly
schools.
competent. Now,
it is a lack of competence, but it's also like an ideological thing. Like, I don't think that I think a lot of Democrats don't really trust parents to raise their kids, and they would prefer someone like the government did it and schools do it. And because of that, I think I think that they were just kind of repelled by this idea of parents having more. Like, look, I was living in Virginia when they had the midterm election, the gubernatorial election where Youngkin was elected, right? Famously, Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic candidate, said that I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach, right? It was a terrible gaffe. Everybody knew it was a gaffe as soon as he said it. But also maybe it was a moment of honesty, right? Like he just didn't really value what parents had to say about how these issues should be taught. Whereas Youngkin, struck a more moderate tone. He's like, look, there needs to be dialogue with parents. We need to bring them in, blah, blah. Of course, when Youngkin took over, it's not like he said like every mom or dad gets a veto over what the school teaches, but he at least had engagement with them, right? Whereas the Democrats really just came across as like, screw the parents, like screw the families. Right. Like, no, we got teachers. We'll tell the teachers what to teach. They'll do it, right? Like that was the attitude. I think that lost a lot of families who I think probably had previously voted Democrat. Some of them swung into the Republican camp because of that.
Right. So I have a policy proposal that's tied to that because I think that in a nation that's a democracy, we need to have public education. But public education means that like kids need to actually learn, not just show up in schools. They need to actually like be able to read and do basic numeracy to not only govern their own lives as free civilians in civil society, but also govern with us as colleagues in this democratic project of America. So we need kids who can read and do basic numeracy at grade level. And that's why we have compulsory public education. And in furtherance of that goal, I think we should pay families when their kids pass a grade level test, right? So every year, the kids already take a ton of tests, standardized tests during the school year. So every year they would take a grade standard test. And if, for example, you come into kindergarten and you can do basic phonics, just, tie a CH to the sound ch. If you can do basic phonics on your first day of kindergarten, the family gets $20,000. And if every year your kid passes their grade level test, not like distinguished, not exceptional, just proficient, just a second grader doing second grade work and passes their second grade test, that family gets $10,000. That at first sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I want to give two kind of accounts for how this kind of works, right? Bolsa Familia, the program down in Brazil, pays families for sending their kids to school because they had a huge truancy problem.
Right.
So in California, where we put them in jail, like in Brazil, they actually pay families for putting them, sending your kid to
Yeah,
school
look,
and
I
being
did
vaccinated.
a couple years ago. I did a
Yeah.
piece talking to Roland Fryer, who's
Mhm.
he was
Yes.
a really kind of wonder kid, economist, Harvard trained, interesting guy, and he actually did an experiment where I think what they did is they paid kids to like do their
Right.
homework,
Right.
and it was really successful. Like it
Yeah.
was like, and like part of the reason it worked also is because you're paying kids to do something a kid can do. It wasn't like you have to get a certain grade to get paid because like that's hard. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
you want what you want because with kids like you have to give them a good like time horizon too, right? You can't be like, well, I'm going to pay you to do something 5 years from now because the kid doesn't think like that, right? You got to be like, no, I'm going to pay you to do this thing you got to be doing every week, and they did it, and like it helped to like improve their grades and everything. And yeah, like we need to be thinking out of the box to do things like that because we have to like change people's behaviors too,
Right.
right? To
Right. And I want
and
to change it
it's
at the family level.
right.
I like it. I want to change it at the family level. So Fryer wanted to pay kids a little bit. I want to pay families a lot to become like the quality of family that's a better partner with the school. Because there are lots of ways to do family that are legitimate, but don't quite work in the United States because of the need for self-governance, right? So I want to incentivize families to actually prioritize the things I'm prioritizing. And since families need money, I want to incentivize families to maybe not take the extra shift working at their job from 3 to 11, but instead say to the boss, like, look, I don't actually need that money because I can get paid for like actually working with my kid, working with them. I don't get paid for just having them. I get paid for making sure my kids are proficient at home. So I think it balances the power between how people earn money. In a way, there's a similar analog to the way in which we pay politicians who don't earn it on civil society, but we pay them so that they do a job in a way that actually is good for the nation as a whole. So this is just it kind of loosens the monopoly of civil society on money in the way that was good for paying political leaders so they don't be corrupt. And I want to pay families so that they aren't corrupt either. It's just that none of those things actually make money, and in an obvious way. And I think that would just be good if we're serious about public education, because if we're serious about public education, it has to be more than just getting kids to show up.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that a lot of people at the very local level,
Right.
they see these issues, right? Like a
Right.
lot of teachers, you talk to them, they're like, well, I can do what I can do, but a big part of my student success is what's happening at the home, right?
Right.
What's happening with their family. Like
Right.
it can be hard to get the parent to come to parent teachers meetings. It can be hard to make sure that they're attending to them at home so they're doing their homework. Are they reading to them? Are they, so on and so forth. And it's something you hear over and over and over. And yet I think when you take it into the political arena, you don't hear it that much, right? Like you don't,
Right.
or if you hear it, you don't hear like a solution, right? You just hear like, oh, it's just nothing we can do about it. It's just how it is, that kind of thing, right?
Right.
But
I'm saying there
actually
is actually,
yeah,
we can change people's behavior by incentivizing them to do the behavior that we think as a nation would be good for us as a nation. And the
right.
funny thing is, it might not surprise you. Who do you think has been more open to this idea? The liberals or the new right, the Josh Hollies of the world? It's actually been the
Yeah,
right.
I
I
think so.
float,
Yeah.
yeah, I float this idea among my right friends, and they're like, actually, that sure, they'll go for it. Now, like a lot of them are racist, and they just think black people are going to fail the test anyway. But others of them are actually just kind of thinking through the arguments that I put forth to you, and they just realize that we need to like help parents direct their energies to making sure their kids can do grade level work, and this might work, and if it works, that's a good use of money. And you do it at the
Mhm.
family level, it supports the families
Well,
exercising discretion.
what's wild is that America finances many of the programs that do this in other countries, right? Like our government does, because like I had a professor when I went to grad school at Syracuse. So one of my professors, she used to be head of the UN World Food Program.
Yeah.
She was like an appointee, and was like one of her programs was girls' education. So
Okay.
they would go around the world and they'd be like, okay, we will give the family X number of like, I don't know, like cooking fuel or cooking oil or like, some kind of subsidy if you let your girl go to school, right?
Right.
And these who funds these programs? I mean, America is one of the biggest donors to UN World Food Program to the UN, right? Like we're actually funding these programs in other places because we acknowledge that helping change family culture in other societies can help them develop, right? So like we spend money to help people in other countries do this because we acknowledge the principle behind it. Like the
Right.
Bolsa Familia program you were describing is actually as a model in many countries now. But we don't really apply that principle to America as much. And sometimes we do. Look, I mean, I have done stories about local school districts that have done their own experiments doing this, but on a broad level, we're not really doing it, right? On
Right.
a national level, we're not doing it. There's no national consensus around it. Um, but it's funny because, like, if you talk to people who work in international development, it's like just common sense. Like, they all want to do this. They all want to do this in sub-Saharan Africa. They all want to do it in Afghanistan. They all want to do it in Northwest Pakistan. They want to do it in Brazil. They all think
Yeah.
it's the most common sense thing in the world to do. But you start talking about doing it in America, and people get all, they get all antsy about it. Like, oh, is it going to be expensive? Oh, should we really be telling people what to do? Oh, is it really a cultural problem? I mean, we both know our mutual friend Brianna gets a little antsy
Yeah.
when we discuss that anyone should change their culture or their behaviors, right?
Right.
But it's not, and I understand why. Look, sometimes people use culture as an excuse to say we're not going to help anybody. Oh, they just have a bad culture. We can't help them. But culture changes all the time, man. Like all the
All the
time,
time.
throughout history, throughout societies, culture is constantly changing. I mean, look at this H1B debate about India, right? Like 40 years ago, no one thought India was a very industrious society or a highly educated society or bringing in like these highly skilled people. All of the stereotypes were in the other direction, right? Like, it's a Hindu rate of growth. They're very anemic. They're very, it's a very scatterbrained and backwards society. But they really emphasized building basic education in India, right? And like getting people through basic development. And like, I think they actually successfully changed some of the cultural mores and attitudes among a lot of Indians by doing that. And because of that, they now have a very large diaspora all over the world that can like run right into these jobs and work the heck out of them and rise to the top of other people's societies, right? Um, because they did that, right? And
Right.
like, if they had just thought we can't change anything about how our people think about education, how our people think about work, how our people think about family, how our people think about technology. If they just had that attitude, then they would never have had the success they're having right
I
now.
mean, we'd
Same
still
thing
be
with the
lynching people in
Chinese.
the, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that we need to, yeah, we do need to avoid the trap of using culture as an excuse not to change something by treating it as unfixable or something that we can't intervene in or change. That is a good point from Be Honest. Sometimes people use it as an excuse just to say nothing can change. But if you view it in a more realistic way, which is something that's malleable, something that changes over time, so it can be changed for the better, then I think the cultural interventions can be very useful or very practical, right? I
Yeah.
think that they have, and in fact, to much of the world, it's just common sense. Much of the
Yeah.
world has no problem hearing that, like, look, we need to make sure that we change our attitude about educating women. We know that when women are educated, that you have much more strong societies, much more economically prosperous, safer, so on and so forth. Um,
How do we change that
that's not
attitude?
right.
How do we change that
Like,
attitude? Well, we can structure incentives so that,
yeah, I mean, look, a lot of culture is downstream from economics, right? Like, if you
right.
have the right incentives to do certain things, then that's what you get. I think a lot of women's education came about because people realized that you don't live in the time anymore where only your physical strength and the men's prowess matters in the market, right? Now, like intellectual capital matters, social capital matters, like emotional intelligence matters. So women can work can bring a lot to the table as well when they're in the workplace. They can bring a lot to the family as well if they're able to work, part-time, full-time, whatever. And it actually helped change the culture of a lot of places. It wasn't just that one day someone just decided, we need to just have a different idea about that. It was, someone wrote a good op-ed or something. Right now, that's not how it happened. What happened is that like the necessities of their life changed, and that their incentive, as you said, the incentives changed, right? So they had a reason to change their behavior that benefited their family, benefited their community, and eventually benefited their entire society. So
yeah, good. And we've both been in different households and we've seen differences, right? So I don't think people understand how radically different cultural mores at the family level are in ways that might advantage one household over another household. Like I said before, my kids can beat me at their age at everything that matters because they're raised in this household as opposed to the household I was raised in, and I was raised by television mostly. So I just want to acknowledge, and I want the Democrats to acknowledge that families matter, and we could build better families for this.
Did you read the piece? So I did a piece actually on Vivek Ramaswamy for the New York Times last week. I wrote an op-ed about what his argument with the H-1B folks, because basically he went on Twitter and he was like, look, the reason that we need these immigrants is because American cultures has all these deficiencies, right? Like Americans just don't value academics the same way. They value like, entertainment or sports, but they don't really value like, nerds and so on and so forth. And so in my op-ed, I said he got some things right, and he kind of left a few things out. Like there are downsides to aspects of South Asian study culture and work culture. But I also said that he had a point, and he had a point that liberals don't really want to acknowledge, which is that like I think there's some people on the left, they think these people succeed because they're like just rich. And it's true that the people who come to the United States from other countries are usually not the poorest people in those societies. They have to have a certain number of resources to come here. But the main advantage they have is they're most ambitious, right? They jump through all the hurdles you have to get through to get here. They're not really coming with bags of money. Like people who come to the United States, like the first waves of like South Asian immigrants that came after the 60s immigration reforms, they worked in like motels and gas stations and Dunkin' Donuts and small businesses. And they raised their kids to like study STEM and go into IT and go into medicine and so on and so forth. And that created the next generation of people. So like, it wasn't their main advantage really was that they're ambitious and they had very strong families, right? And a very strong
families in a specific way.
Exactly. In a way that kind of attuned itself to survival in the United States, right? Like they were like, look, we came from a society that had like perpetual famines and wars and endemic poverty everywhere you look. We got the golden ticket to America. So we're going to work our asses off to make sure that we can survive here. We're going to give you those exact same values. And I get into this in the New York Times piece. I think sometimes it goes overboard because I think maybe some Indian, Pakistani parents have this attitude of survival even when they've really made it, and they don't really have to be like extremely frugal all the time, or like kids don't always have to be studying all the time. Like they can overdo it. But at the same time, like this culture of survival really gave them a foothold in the United States, right? And that is something other people can learn from, right? Like the way you say you're raising your kids, I think that's really important because if children have to they basically take after two things. They take after their parents, they take after their peer groups, right? So, and like most of how you end up as an adult kind of is your childhood, right? Like it doesn't mean you can't change as an adult. I'm not trying to say that. Like you can change until the last day of your life to some extent, but it's a very, very impressionable part of your life. Your basic values are set, your work ethic is set. Those things are very, very hard to change once you get older. It's the same reason why like little kids are really good at learning languages, right? Because like at that point in your life, you're just taking things in like from everywhere around you, right? And the older you get, like the harder it is. Even like, I don't know, like I learned how to play guitar in my 30s, right? My guitar teacher even kind of like poked fun at me. He's like, yeah, if you had done this 10 years ago, it'd probably be easier for you, right? Like the older you get, the harder it is to learn new things and to change your ways. And so, yeah, like the way that children are raised is extremely important. And I think like Glenn Loury talks about this. I think liberals often admit this through their behavior, the way they raise their children personally. Sometimes like they are a little bit harder on them. They do want them to study more. They want them to have good friends and relationships. They want them to be loyal to people. But they kind of have a hard time expressing that in public though, right? Like they'll do it for their own kids, but then when they talk about it like as a matter of social policy or cultural issues, they feel really, really uncomfortable saying any of that, right? Whereas like I think what's refreshing about you, Rami, is like you'll say it. Like, like you'll say the very common sense thing that everyone is doing in their lives and everyone's recognizing in the world around them, but they won't bring it out into the public, which is unfortunate because like you have to have some level of intentionality, I think, to do this,
I
right?
think so.
You have to set out. You have to set out to raise your kids in a certain way. You have to set out to create a certain environment for them. You have to set out to have a certain type of schoolyard or a certain type of curriculum that I think benefits children and do these things, right? Doing it on accident is very messy, right?
Well, I've said before, I think in the United States, because of the civil rights movement, because of a lot of work that Native Black people have done in working this land, we've made it the case that you could come to the United States, and if you have a family that's culturally disposed in the right way, you don't need a dime. If you have a family that's culturally disposed in the right way, a family that knows what parents are for and knows like that treats children in a way as like a project, a family project, you can do very well in the United States that Black Americans have made for the United States. Not alone, but like a lot of people who fought through Jim Crow and worked in the civil rights movement to make this nation a nation of laws have made it the case that if you come from a Vivek Ramaswamy, if you come from a good family, if you come from a family that knows what they're doing and isn't going to get like distracted and doesn't think of like children as like liberal agents, but actually as products of the family and thinks of children as like the family project and knows that as soon as you have kids, everything else in your life just kind of is a hobby. Like it could be a very fulfilling hobby, but once you have kids, like everything else is a hobby, and then the whole family's organized around making the kids as good as they can. If you know that, if you come from a family, you don't need money. You don't need money for your kids to do well, because we've finally made a nation of laws, and like you can just feed on all on all of the suckers who come from unfortunate families or infelicitous cultures. So I do think it's not necessarily a money thing. And I've looked at enough families that I've seen, and I think it's attestable that if you come from a family culture that's appropriate, you can make it in America. The thing is, I also want, and I think this is where we might disagree. I also want Americans to acknowledge that one of the reasons why Black families do not do as well in America is that the United States attacked the Black culture in a way that, like, you could say the Jews went through a lot during the Holocaust, but they came over as like intact Jews. They came over to the United States as intact Jews. Like there's still a Haggadah. There's no Black Haggadah because it would have been rewritten by a Klans member.
Look, I remember being I think I was in a taxi. I think it was in DC. And the taxi driver was Black, and he was asking me all these questions about my family background and everything, which is funny because white people will never do that in DC because they're too liberal and they think it's offensive to like ask where you're from, which is stupid.
He was just
it's
curious.
Not offensive. Yeah, he was just curious. And then eventually he told me, I think that's great that you know all that. You said that we Black people don't really know that much about our family history, right? Because it was taken from us, and like we just don't have those roots. And I think that was a reasonable point. Like when you have when your family is actively undermined by a long set of policies that lasted dozens of years, it's going to have an impact. And it takes a lot of work to get out of that situation, I think. And I don't think anyone can deny that it had some impact. I think people debate how much the impact was. People debate a lot about how to get out of it. And I think that's probably the more important debate to have. Because like we can't really reverse time. Right. But what we can do is think about what we're going to do going forward. Because it is a reality that, like,
monstrous differences between families.
No, there's huge differences between families. And also, like, those differences are something everybody can learn from. Like, we talk about collapse of the family in America. It's not, although you're right that it probably happened earlier with African Americans for a number of reasons. It has impacted other communities, right? Like, there was more fatherlessness among whites, like poor whites especially. Among Latinos and other groups, and the impact is often similar. So, like, the one thing I would say is that, like, while your point is well taken and largely correct, it is something that other people can relate to and understand, I think, and that might actually help people understand what you're saying. If you can say that, look, what happened with Black people in the Black family, it has happened to other families as well. Maybe not to the same extent or for the same reasons, but because of that, you should be able to relate to what I'm saying, because you can see, if you live in a trailer park in Georgia, you can see a lot of the same maladjustments, right? Among white folks. And you can tell people, look, there's nothing inherently wrong with us. The only thing that was more wrong with us is that we were mistreated in certain ways that created some of the same maladjustments you see among other people, right? We're not any different. It's just a matter of how we were treated. And, by the way, addressing it with us will also help you understand how to address it with other people, because we're not 100% unique with these problems either.
No. And I do think a lot of it's just we didn't work out what advanced market liberalism means for families.
Mhm.
And and in a world where marketing is more invasive, like people are giving their kids screens. I don't have my kids don't have screens. I don't understand why parents would do this, but I think I'm right. And anyway, and where marketing is more invasive, and they let like apps and AI and all these things teach their kids things, and then they're surprised when they let their kids be raised by the market, and it just doesn't work out very well for the
Mhm.
kids. I think we need to just take this seriously as a society about how markets and marketing might undermine the work of families for society.
Mhm.
And actually, the black family was ushered right from Jim Crow into like market liberalism, which explains like the divorce rates and all these other things, and without any sort of prophylactic to protect the family from more liberal excesses. And I think that's an unfortunate aspect of just modern society. And I think other communities are susceptible to it unless you're training your community not to be susceptible to it. Anytime I see a kid with a phone, I'm just thinking, well, that's an unfortunate household. And maybe that's a little bit snobbish of me, but I think I'm right. And I think there's a lot at stake in getting these things right. Right.
Right.
And we're not going to find out the downsides for another, 20 or 30 years. And
Right.
and
Well, it's also, we just have to think about how we approach it. We know how some people on the left, respond to some of these critiques or some of these ideas. And I think the main hurdle is really that people think you're blaming the victim, right? And I'm like, well, part of what I do is like I tutor kids, right?
right.
And like when I'm teaching a kid, like this is not how you do the math problem. This is a better way to do the math problem. Or this is not how you understand this grammar issue on the SAT. This is how you should understand it. I'm not blaming them. I'm trying
Right.
to help them, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm trying to help. Once I'm able to teach them how this skill, they're going to be doing it on their own. They might even be doing it better than I do, right? They might succeed more than I do in life. In fact, I hope they do, and they likely will in many cases. I think every generation can get better than the previous generation if everything's going correct. It's not really blaming, right? But I think certain people just think that if you talk about behavioral change at all, that this means that you're putting it all on them, that you don't think anything wrong happened to them. I mean, look, no one with any sense in their mind can deny what happened to Black people in America, from being brought as slaves, they're being put through savage systems of discrimination. Nobody with any sense in their mind can deny that. Nobody with any sense in their mind can deny how
Okay.
much Black folks face stereotypes today, right? Like even on issues like housing or jobs or so on and so forth, people often will approach a Black person with a preconception in their mind before even getting to know them, right? Before even knowing a single thing about them, meeting them, understanding their mind, their attitudes, their behaviors. They will come with a preconception that already disadvantages that person, right?
Right.
And look, I think it has improved in some recent years. We have become slightly more tolerant society. That's good, but those things still exist. All that can be acknowledged and respected while still saying that, like, look, if we want to improve any unit in this, white, black, brown, whatever, starting with the family and talking about what a family can do, to better improve the way kids are raised, to better improve the importance and emphasis on academics, on on strenuous, at times strenuous hard work in various areas. I mean, all those things are only going to help this situation, right?
Yeah.
And look, I don't want to get chauvinistic about it. It's not a matter of like one group is better or worse. Everyone was dealt hands they had no control over
Right.
whatsoever, particularly Black people in America. I mean, that's one of the groups in this country that I think was dealt so many hands that they had absolutely no, choice in whatsoever. There was no other path available for them, right?
We could admit
Um,
that there have been some maladaptions to
mm,
that situation. I think it's perfectly
mm,
reasonable to admit that there have been some maladaptions to that situation. And it's not
mhm,
just about material poverty, although it's tied to material poverty, but there have been some
right,
maladaptions that like people who can be in similar economic circumstances but don't have those same maladaptions with respect to family can actually thrive. And what I don't like is using those people and calling them the model minority as opposed to the other
right,
minority, which is a non-model minority.
right. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that I also think that like there are a lot of positive adaptations. If you go and you look for them, you will
Yeah,
find
yeah.
a lot of positive adaptations, right? Like Atlanta has a massive like black middle class now, right? And it's really funny. I think in DC, if you live there, a lot of the liberal people there associate being black with being poor just because that kind of is a situation in DC, right? But I never really had that association growing up just because I knew lots of successful, like really well attuned to their environments and like highly educated black people because that was what Atlanta was. But where did that come from? A lot of people don't know the background of that. Where it comes from is really the airport. So when
Right.
Hartsfield Jackson Airport was built, Maynard Jackson made sure to steer a lot of the contracts to black communities that had been denied for so long under segregation and Jim Crow. And so what that did is it created an injection of capital into those communities that gave them the opportunity
Stable
to do things.
capital.
One,
Yeah.
good paying jobs, let them have good school, better schools, let them have the right resources for their kids. And also, like they were working, they were building things, right? So they developed, I think, better cultural attitudes, right? And so like that helped build a big black middle class around Atlanta that doesn't exist among many, I think, comparable cities in the United States. I don't think you'll see it the same way in Birmingham. I don't think you'll see it the same way in Jackson, right? And like that was an intervention from the government that I think not only improved people's material life, but also probably improved them culturally as well, right? Because I think it gave them kind of an industrious kind of business oriented class in Atlanta. Now, of course, maybe you could say that has downsides too politically. I think some of those people now maybe are almost like old money and they don't want to change things sometimes. But okay, that's fine. But I think it was a real improvement to the lives of these people to be able to have this like powerful middle class in this city. And it's really funny. Who's that? Who's the actor who plays Don Draper in Mad Men? What's his name again?
John Hamm.
John Hamm, yeah. So there was an interview with John Hamm because they film so many movies in Atlanta now because of the
Right.
Hollywood tax credit, right? And he gave an interview saying something like, "I'm shocked when I come to Atlanta. In LA, everything's segregated. You never see like black people and white people sitting together in the cafes I go to, but here everyone's mixed." And I'm like, "Yeah, John Hamm, I'm glad you recognize that because that is a success that Atlanta built and Georgia built here through being affordable and also through putting this effort into building a minority middle class here." So like yeah, look, I don't think we're perfect. We still have a lot of problems here, but that is at least one success story that we can talk about, right? In terms of how we built something that a lot of people would never have imagined possible because they do think that, those maladaptations you're talking about, they are pessimistic about them, right? They think they're unchangeable, they're unfixable. You can't do anything about that. I mean, you're doing it in your own family. The way that you're raising your kids is your proof of concept that from one generation to the next, we can always see successive improvements.
Right. And my
I
kids
think
are
that's
winning.
true.
Yeah.
That's true for every group. That's true for every group. Everyone can always raise. I think everyone draws lessons in their lives based on how they were raised, and they take notes, right? They take mental notes, like what are some things I wish I had when I was a kid? What do I want to do for my kids? I'm sure our kids will do the same thing. They're going to say, "Well, what did Dad not do for me? I want to do make sure I do for my kids," right? So that's just progress, man. That's like how it works, and I think, I think we can be very optimistic about it, actually.
Yeah, and intentional at every level in supporting that quality of progress.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to pivot to one, actually, the two small issues I want to talk to before I let you go. One is you
Sure.
had an interview with Peter Thiel many years ago. It was, mind and mind with the PayPal billionaire, in which he said that, look, Zed, you might not know this, but if you're only a single digit millionaire, you don't have real access to the legal system. So I had to help out Hulk Hogan because he was just a single digit millionaire and I actually wanted to support his rights. And if you're only a single digit millionaire, you don't have real access to the legal system. And I want to build a policy. I want to presume that he's not lying. There's no reason he would just make that up. He thinks that as a billionaire, he has different access to the legal system and to be able to contest his rights relative to either of us. So I don't think he is telling his truth, and his truth might just be true, and it might not be just. So I think we should have a legal care for all system on the model of Medicare for all. And if we're going to be a nation of laws, that means we need to secure everybody equal access to lawyers.
I did a story about bail court. So the Constitution requires that you have at least a public defender in your trial process, right? But it does not require that for your initial hearing pre-trial, which is like your bail hearing, right?
Right.
So a lot of people actually end up just like behind bars because they have no one to argue for them at that point,
Right.
right? Like literally nobody. So I did a story about I think it was Allegheny County, it's like Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, decided to start pooling money and assigning people those lawyers on the front end. And what they found was when they did that, that a lot fewer people were going to jail because they actually had someone to jail pre-trial, meaning before they even been convicted of anything,
Right.
because they actually had someone to argue their case for them, right? It wasn't just some poor guy who was just like arrested and like, didn't really know what to say or
Confused.
do.
They take your glasses.
Exactly, right? So like that was a shocking story for me to do though, because I think everyone thinks, oh yeah, they'll give you a public defender, but they won't actually through the whole process, not even at that beginning process where you could be put behind bars without being convicted of anything. You're not actually guaranteed a lawyer under our constitutional system. So yeah, like what Tia was saying, and actually I don't think I interviewed him. I think I wrote about it, but I think someone else did the interview. I did write about it though. I do remember that. He's probably right. Look, like if you are in a very like high stakes litigious situation, which would be like Hulk Hogan versus Gawker, I don't remember who owned Gawker at that point, but I'm sure it was someone with a lot of resources. So like, yeah, actually being a single digit millionaire probably puts you at a disadvantage if you are trying to sue a conglomerate, if you're trying to sue like a large company or firm. Even Hulk Hogan's at a disadvantage there, right? So like, yeah, I mean, look, I think Teal probably had his own reasons because obviously Gawker went after Teal a lot. But what he said was not wrong either. I don't think he actually there's actually probably some truth to what he was saying.
Right. So if we equal the playing field and just kind of, you might have to abolish private attorneys and just have a separate hearing for like what kind of legal resources you need. There needs to be a different process. But if we're going to be a nation of laws, I think these are the issues we need to take seriously. If all of this is going to be hashed out in the courts, and there's specialized knowledge, and you need access to lawyers, and so if we're going to be a nation of laws, we need to guarantee everyone access to a lawyer, and maybe even accountants if we're going to be a nation of taxes. I think there should be like Medicare for all, accountants for all. If we're going to be the nation of taxes.
I mean, just getting the government to actually give us free tax filing has been a struggle, right? Like they rolled it out over a few states, and who knows if the Republicans want to keep it. Some of the Republicans don't like it. I think the tax prep people are really in bed with them, and like, yeah. But you're right. There are a bunch of things in our society where like they're just basic things that you need to function and to actually prosper. It's not like anyone's asking someone else to do all your work for you, but like there are things that just like if you just happen to not have a bunch of Scrooge McDuck bank vault of gold coins, it can be really difficult to navigate them and just get basic things done for yourself so that you can actually attend to your family and do your job and so on and so forth. And you're right, like things like accounting, lawyering, healthcare in catastrophic situations. I mean, look, everyone's going to get sick. Everyone's going to have something happen to their health that they have zero control over. It's inevitable, right? Like
something very expensive.
Yeah, like it's just like, these crazy things that just pop up and like hit you. Yeah, they do make your life really difficult. And I think you are just better off being in a, like this is something we can learn from other parts of the world where they give people a little bit more insurance in these situations and also just guarantee that they're not going to be tripped up by something that's completely out of their control, which unfortunately we have a lot of precarity in the United States. And you can be tripped up by those things.
Right. And unnecessary precarity. Unnecessary, like the political solution to this issue. Now, last question, big question, the question that's on everybody's mind. Luigi Mangione, net positive for American culture or negative? What do you think? Opening 2025.
I don't know what the long-term ramifications of that is going to be because it's very, very hard to say. Because I think obviously when it happened, it sparked a lot of discussion about what was happening in the healthcare system. I think a lot of other things are happening after that. It got swept out of the news, but there will be a trial, right? And the trial, I think, will be an opportunity to bring it back up. So it's very, very hard to say at this point. I wrote a piece at my Substack talking to a pro-life activist. And the reason I spoke to the pro-life activist about this was because the pro-life movement kind of had the same debates around like bombings of abortion clinics, assassinations of abortion doctors. And, she was kind of explaining to me how like, she thinks violence is wrong and how the movement got past that. But it is also the case that like when you had those high profile killings, everyone in the country was talking about abortion. And a lot of people who are in the pro-life movement were like, look, we don't agree with any violence, but like we do think this is an evil system. And like we can't stop saying it's an evil system. And I think people on the side who are really critical of the healthcare system, which is a lot of people in America, mostly on the left, but people outside the left also I think are. I think they've had to face a similar dilemma, which is like they can't validate a murder. Murder is wrong, and it would be politically toxic to do that. On the other hand, you can't drop the issue, right? You cannot say that what United Healthcare does is correct, right? Like what United Healthcare does every single day is causing a lot of suffering to other people, right? It's not going to change based on one CEO, right? He's a replaceable person. I'm going to put someone else in there who does the exact same thing. But something has to give here, right? Like
there's going to be a trial. There's going to be a long.
Yeah, and is it just going to be Luigi on trial, or is it going to be the whole healthcare system on trial?
It's going to be United Healthcare on trial.
Right? Exactly. I think when I don't know if you've seen the movie Denzel Washington, John Q. Have you seen that movie?
I haven't seen the movie. I remember when it came out, and I know like he took over a hospital for something similar.
Yeah. Like basically he can't get his insurance to pay for a procedure that will save his child's life.
Right.
And the hospital will not do it pro bono. And so he gets very desperate and he takes it over, takes him hostage and says, look, you got to do the procedure. You got to save my child's life. Mm-hmm. And he becomes kind of a folk hero in the country because there's people all over the country who are in the same situation who are like, I really need something medically, but I cannot do it. I cannot afford it. And people line up outside the hospital cheering him. And, the cops are in a hostage standoff with him. And like, it's what's crazy about that movie, though, is this was released. I think it was released either late 90s, probably early 2000s.
I think 2000. I was working at the like 2004.
I feel like it got really bad reviews at the time, and a lot of people were like, "This is melodramatic," and like blah blah blah. I guess maybe it was just a conservative culture thing, right? Like Americans weren't ready for the conversation. I almost feel like if the movie was released today, it would be received much better because I think the culture has become much more populist and much more introspective about corporate power and about the healthcare system and so on and so forth. Because back then, I think people thought it was overwrought. But I watched it at the time. I didn't think it was overwrought at all. I thought, any dad who was in that circumstance would feel tempted to do that. I think, any dad would do that. I didn't think it was an exaggeration at all in the circumstance that was put in the film. But yeah, it's a good question. I think we'll all be watching it. I don't think healthcare in America is getting any dramatically more affordable anytime soon. So I don't think the issue is going to go away. Yeah,
there's going to be, I don't think the issue is going to go away because there's going to be a lurid trial. There's going to be discovery. And then like, as soon as the bodies get unearthed from United Healthcare, we're going to find out how bad it is to have an AI decide who gets coverage and who doesn't. And I think the whistleblowers have just started to come up. There are a lot of people who are like, who spent the last 10 years denying claims that they felt a little bit icky about and now didn't have a voice, but they're going to start getting on YouTube and start like dropping tips about like, I was pressured to deny this claim. And I think that like, because of the trial, we're going to have a different quality of conversation about what it means to have not even a death panel, but to have a death program that's AI that decides who lives and dies. And what does that mean in a political democracy? Well, we would think that the process should be like at least democratized in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and I don't think it would have happened without this assassination. Now, I don't think we need to kill any more of them. I don't think that. I think there's a diminishing return in terms of like spectacle murder. We got the trial. So as long as the trial like keeps dribbling out every week, something awful comes out about United Healthcare, I think that's going to be enough to make it a debate now and get the political solution that we need. Luigi Mangione, Times Man of the Year for 2025.
Yeah, look, it's a whole thing. I think that there's no way people can keep dodging this issue forever. I mean, I think everyone in Washington
they can. Yes, they can.
Everyone in Washington is scared of hospitals, doctors, insurers, pharmaceuticals, all these people that have a ton of money and bags of money. But like, they should be kind of scared of people who are just like dealing with these problems, healthcare problems all the time, right? Like, I think they should be also scared of that because, it's just not going away. Like, how can people live like this forever?
I just think I don't underestimate the strength of systems to keep it going in perpetuity. Like, I know. I think it's ridiculous that Nancy Pelosi made it for like 25 years or whatever without taking a debate and like as a congressperson. And
Right.
like, I think that's
Yeah.
ridiculous. And there's no way that would stand. But I think it could
Yeah.
have
I
gone till
mean,
the sun burns
it
out.
is a good point because I think sometimes people say a system is strong if it's stable, but
Yeah.
also I think a system is weak if it's too stable, right? Because that suggests that the system is not capable of change or like actually tending to problems, right? Like it's like I think we should stop thinking of a system as great if it's just like keeping everything in check, right? Like there's more that a system really should do here. So
Be responsive. All right.
yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, it was great being
Um,
here, Rami.
Great, great. And once again, if they want to see more of your work or kind of get more in your mind, where should they find you?
Yeah, so like I try to maintain a presence on social media on Twitter, and I try to post my articles because I freelance various places, but also I have my own Substack newsletter. It's theamericansaga.com, where I write something once or twice a week. So yeah, that'd
And
be
then
a great place to check me out.
everything from telepathy to
Yes.
like world governance.
Yeah, no, the telepathy stories have been interesting because it's actually about like autism and exploitation of children and like all these kinds of things that I think have really created they created kind of it's not my usual beat, but like I think it's not at all my usual beat to like write about like pseudoscience and stuff, but like because there's like child exploitation involved, I feel like kind of like it's just a social responsibility to kind of dive into this stuff. So yeah, I definitely recommend. Like I know it sounds weird writing about telepathy and autism, but like it's a really interesting story if you guys want to dive into it. So
Yeah, and it's got subterranean roots. It's wider spread than
mm,
people I think know about. Anyway, thank you for
mhm.
your time, audience. I'll be back at a different time to talk about something completely different, probably tomorrow, maybe the next day. But if you liked me having guests, go ahead, say so in the comments. And if you appreciate what I'm doing, go to www.funkyacademic.com, kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month, and I'll kind of keep doing it. Peace.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Rami.